Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today we've got our third and maybe final video in our series on the Battlecarrier conversion plans that we found in the museum's collection. And in the 2 or 3 weeks or so since we found these original documents, we've been able to find a lot of information. And I hope that you guys enjoy the style of how we've made these videos as much as I do, because very much the first video was what we know now after having barely had a chance to look at things. I might have a half hour in any given day to go through a new box of collections like this, so I didn't get the chance to see every single document in there. We were able to look at some of the low-hanging fruit and get an idea of what was there, and then we made a video about it. So definitely didn't have all the information because we didn't have all the information. But by making that video, we got a ton more information from you guys. Some of you had more expertise on this or some other information that added to the scholarship. So a couple days later, when I'd had a chance to go through a few more of the blueprints, we were able to make another video. And now I've finally gotten the chance to read the book that came with it, go through all of the various documents here, and we think we've got a working timeline. Also during this time period, we were able to find out who the original donor of these documents were. And he worked at Lakehurst on aviation stuff, and so these documents were sent there to review, and they relate to all the aviation things related to the Iowa-class battleships from that time period. When he retired, these were all declassified, and I guess he had them in his office and he took them with him, and then donated them to the museum when the museum opened up. So really cool. The donor has a connection to the museum. He's still here in the New Jersey area, and he was able to fill in a little bit of information on these documents, but he wasn't involved in the original documents. Now, during the last couple of weeks, we've also been able to do some research on the timeline of the Battlecarrier conversion. So it all starts before the Iowas have even been reactivated with a Naval Institute Proceedings magazine article written by a Charles Myers. So Chuck Myers was part of quote-unquote the fighter mafia in the Pentagon, and he worked with a ton of aviation stuff. He worked on early stealth planes. He worked on many of the fighter jets that are currently still in active use by the Air Force and Navy, and was a huge name in the aviation community at that time. Unfortunately, he has since passed away. He was also one of the earliest proponents to reactivate the Iowa-class battleships, and his concept for reactivating them was the Battlecarrier concept. So he puts forward a proposal in proceedings, and he is one of those advocates who pushes things through Congress, and he rightly deserves credit for being one of the folks who raised enough awareness to get the Iowas reactivated in the 80s. It ended up that they were not reactivated to the extent that he would have preferred, but without him, there's a strong chance that these ships never get brought back. Proceedings is an interesting magazine because oftentimes somebody will post an article and then somebody else will refine the ideas. And there's a later article by a guy named Pulver that kind of refines the Battlecarrier concept. And it's progressing far enough that Martin Marietta actually produces a model. And so these articles and these models are what are publicly available online for you to look at. And it seems like these are all done before the ship is reactivated. So the work that's actually done in reactivating isn't known. So you see a lot of like the Vietnam era features that will be obliterated in the 80s reactivation retained in these original drawings or models or anything like that. Now, because these actual Navy-produced drawings have been sitting in archives at first at Lakehurst and then here on the battleship for the last 30, 40 years, nobody knew what the actual Navy plan was. All that was known was the things in these Naval Institute proceedings magazines or the Martin Marietta model. And so there have been a number of people who have thought that this was a really cool concept, who have made their own models or drawings since then. And so those show up online, and they show a lot of the same features over and over again, but not necessarily the features that were actually used on these ships. So many of the models have the ship with its superstructure here, and then twin flight decks coming off of it with ski jumps on the end. And that was the plan for short takeoff and landing aircraft that was put forward in these articles and in these models. And that way, if the guns are firing to the port side, then you can be launching aircraft on the starboard side, and vice versa. You're firing the guns to starboard, you can still launch aircraft to port. Well, now from these Navy drawings, we know that they only ever planned to have a standard port side angled flight deck. The starboard side was going to be where they had their underway replenishment area and their deck park area. Because, let's face it, this ship would have never done flight ops and firing her main guns at the same time. And it's likely that she wouldn't have had the electrical power to do that. It's like we know about the ships in the 80s. They get all these new electrical intensive systems added, but their generators are not increased, so they're not getting any more power. So they can either fire their missiles or fire their guns. Likewise, they can either do these really intensive flight operations, or they can fire the guns. Which again, this ship would have aircraft, it would have missiles, it would have guns, and these are all engaging targets at very different ranges. So, now that we've got a little background on where these design proposals came from, we can sort of date the various documents that are here. So first off, we've got this stack of documents that we talked about already. It shows the ship very much in her Vietnam configuration being modernized. So that predates any of the 1980s work, even the design work that was done. And so like you can see things like the middle triple stack of 40mm guns around the funnels and other features like that that will be obliterated in the 80s update. Now by this second drawing, which is no longer handwritten notes like it was passed around an office, but is actually like a typed up report that maybe these were someone's projection slides or something for an actual presentation on these are our options, which ones do we want to proceed with. These show the ship more in her 80s configuration. So these may antedate the design work for what actually leads to the ship being like it is now. Next up, we've got a pair of folders here, which are really cool because they take the ship's Vietnam plans and they basically white out, and you can actually see white out in some areas, some of the original stuff at the fantail of the ship, and it is physically taped on printed out and cut out drawings of aircraft. There are at least 4 different types of aircraft depicted. The AV-8B Harrier II, which still is, probably phased out by the lightning, but was a vertical takeoff and landing fighter used by the Navy at this time period. But there's also this AWACS aircraft depicted here. And then on the inner page, we've got 2 other aircraft. One that looks like an S-3 Viking with A-10 engines on top of the wing. And this other one that's got this weird canard drawing. And keep in mind that these drawings show them with the wings folded for storage. And it even has taped on here where the bomb elevators are going to be, where the mules and other flight deck equipment is going to be, like the vehicles and stuff that would tow them around. So it's really cool showing what that would include. So this has a ship that's able to carry between its deck park and its hangar something like 25 aircraft of at least 4 different types, some very large AWACS type aircraft and some small fighter aircraft like the Harrier. and of various types of aircraft. We found an interesting report on the types of aircraft here, and that's going to be a future video, sort of unrelated to these plans. But we'll talk more about those later on. Then we have this document, which is produced February of '81. So it predates the ship even being pulled out of mothballs to start work in spring of '81, and certainly predates her being completely reactivated in '82. And this one, they hire a government contracting group called John J. McMillan Associates, and he's working with somebody at NAVSEA named Philip Sims, and they work from October 1980 to February '81 to do a study of what an air-capable Iowa-class battleship would be. This study addresses the conversion of a BB-61 class battleship to an air-capable ship, designated BBA for the purposes of this study, having as its primary mission strike warfare. The BB-62 was selected as the baseline ship. So they go through and they essentially say that New Jersey is the only one fit to receive this modification because of her 60s era modification. So the other ones would be too expensive. And it goes through and it says that this would be a ridiculous amount of work to do with the amount of removal of materials. Interestingly, they're also citing an aircraft carrier design study from the 1970s for a kind of light aircraft carrier that would have carried exclusively VTOL or STOVL, vertical takeoff and landing, or short takeoff and landing aircraft. So significantly smaller than the expensive Nimitz-class aircraft carriers that were being built then, which would then give the Navy like a midline asset that they could deploy in place of super expensive modern nuclear carriers, super carriers. And that was the same idea for why you would reactivate the battleships, is because you can then send a battleship battle group there. So it sort of makes sense to mix those two groups, and it certainly makes sense to take those design studies as the baseline to see, well, how much space do they have to dedicate to aircraft? How much fuel do they need for their flight group and whatnot, to then overlay this on the existing studies that were already going around that were maybe a little too pie in the sky. For example, this says that while the number 25 has been thrown out on types of aircraft, we only looked at using, quote unquote, I think it was type A aircraft. There are type A, B, and C VTOL aircraft that were being looked at this time period. Again, we're going to make a future video on that. So they limited the air group type to 2 aircraft, both of the type A variety, as opposed to the 4 that these are showing. And they determined that they could fit comfortably 16 aircraft, not the 25 that are shown taped on here. And there's enough physical space for 25 aircraft, but that's implying a deck park that is eating into the angled flight deck. It's implying that there's an aircraft on the elevator, and there is very little room to move aircraft around and shuffle them as, okay, this one in the back is fueled and armed. How do we get it to an elevator, to the flight deck to actually launch the thing? So they look at all that and decide, yeah, no, 25 not possible. 16 more likely, supporting 4 different types of aircraft, some of them very large, not possible. Harriers and an AWACS type aircraft, of which there might be like a half a dozen used for carrier onboard delivery, COD, or AWACS, or maybe even anti-submarine warfare to supplement the Harriers. And these aircraft aren't going to be able to do like heavy bomb strike missions. Their main task is going to be to fly out there and do reconnaissance and find targets for the ship's Tomahawk missiles. This is still showing a ship with a very large Tomahawk missile battery, and to find targets for the 16-inch guns. So the jobs that the battleship had other assets in her battle group or her RPV drones take over in the 80s, as opposed to what they're envisioning here in 1980-81 timeframe. Also, interestingly, they're recommending against, even though they're adding vertical launch tubes, they're recommending against doing like all the radars and electronics for standard missiles and everything else for anti-aircraft capabilities. And they're looking at only having the missiles for strike capabilities, Tomahawks, Harpoons, like the ship actually got. So that's paring down the amount of work, the amount of sensors, the amount of electrical stuff that the ship is going to have on her, because they're actually doing the math here to see what the power draws of this new, all these new systems are going to be, and they're determining that it can't do everything that these pie-in-the-sky drawings are asking for. And it seems like, I still haven't figured it out yet, it might be that the full blueprints of the changes just barely predate this, or it might be that after this, the full blueprints are based off of this drawing. Because there is a page in here that shows a side profile drawing of the ship that very much matches what's on the blueprints, and I can't tell if that is the blueprints are taken off of that much smaller drawing, or that is a smaller drawing based off of the blueprints. So it's hard to say which comes first. But this is, here it is. Yeah, so it looks extremely similar to what we actually get on the drawings over here. But it seems like this is the wake-up moment for the Navy that, hey, all this stuff that Myers and Pulver and Martin Marietta have been suggesting is too expensive, too much work, and it may even be that some of the ship's doctrine is being taken out of this for the actual design that's done. For example, only having strike missiles, only Tomahawks and Harpoons, as opposed to the SM-2s and the Sea Sparrows and everything else that some of these pie-in-the-sky drawings are showing. Now, another interesting thing, because these drawings predate the ship actually being recalled to even start her work, I was starting to believe that what's out there on the internet, that all of this was for a Flight 2, like the 4 Iowas are brought in over the early 80s and reactivated, and then in the late 80s, they start doing the Flight 2 modification, and oftentimes you see it said that only New Jersey was going to get that. There's a document linked down below that includes that information. That Flight 2 conversion is going to start happening in the late 80s on New Jersey. So seeing these being done before the ship is even modernized made me think that, hey, maybe it wasn't Flight 1, Flight 2, maybe it was, we've got this whole range of options from the cheapest, what the ship actually gets, to the most expensive, what they're looking at here with the Battlecarrier conversion. But given some other information on when the aircraft being depicted here would be available, when vertical launch tubes for these missiles would be available for new construction, it really pushes this work out to the late 80s, as opposed to knowing that the ships are going to be reactivated just a couple of months after this report is produced. Or they're going to start the reactivation process just a couple of months after this report is produced, I should say. So what do you think about VTOL aircraft? Do you think they would have added something to the Navy or to the Iowa-class battleships if they were more widely adopted? Let us know in the comment section down below, and stay tuned for our future video on the Navy's plans to go to an all-VTOL Air Force. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. It's what gives us the time to do new research on stuff like this, and then also make it available to you. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about our museum and the channel. Thanks for watching.